Thank you. Yeah, so I think in terms of how we should assess adequacy, I think we're in a better place in terms of understanding what adequacy is and how we might measure it than we might have been 15 years ago. So there's been a lot of work done, and I'm sure Donald Tusk will talk about this, but in relation to minimum income standards, there's a whole history of work around reference budgets. That's work that I think should be drawn on, and as Ryan has said earlier as well, there are different measures of poverty. We need to include those in our assessment of what adequacy is, which I think then to think about the principles around adequacy, we're really going to what is the purpose of our social security system, which I think is something that's never been clearly articulated and has gone through various changes over the decades in the post-war period, but it's never, to my mind, really been firmly pinned down. So understanding what the purpose of our social security system is, and I'm sure we might touch on that a little bit later. In terms of adequacy and the principles that we ought to be thinking about in relation to adequacy and the setting of social security benefits, I think transparency is an important principle. It's one that, as other witnesses have already said, isn't really there. So how the figure that we end up with for benefit payments at the moment is arrived at is very unclear. And I think other principles we need to be thinking about is the use of evidence in itself as a principle, that we base the way that we set social security benefits on sound social scientific evidence. Again, I think we're in a much better place than we might have been 10, 15, 20 years ago to be able to do that. And then there's other principles around, I think, involvement. So listening to people who have experience of using the social security system and understanding of what adequacy means from that perspective, as well as drawing on broader data around the public's understanding of adequacy, I think is important. And then again, going back to the purpose of our social security system, I think we need to think about the dignity of those who are using the social security system when we're setting benefit levels. So those are some of the principles. In terms of the benefits that should be included, I think it's almost possibly easier to think about what is it that should be excluded and why. And I think in any part of the social security system, we need to be thinking about adequacy and how we set any of the levels of entitlement that people have. And so I think it's better to be inclusive in the inquiry about what benefits we would include. I would also say in particular, just to reflect on others have said about working age benefits, and particularly the levels for people without children, and also for younger people aged less than 25, what adequacy means there, I think is very important. And then we could also think about the inquiry could look at particular issues around child maintenance, around carers allowance. The impact of deductions has already been mentioned, I think a really critical issue, as is the benefit cap and the impact that some of these measures have on the adequacy of benefits. And one final point in terms of the scope of the kind of benefits, I think we need to recognise that our social security system has changed with devolution. There is more scope for other parts of the UK to be delivering social security benefits. So a consideration of how adequacy is or is not considered in those contexts, I think would also be useful.
Thank you very much.
Colleagues have made some of the points that I would have done, particularly around the principles that are embedded into the social security system in Scotland, and thinking about how those are actually realised in practice, I think is particularly important. The principle around making a contribution to reducing poverty, in particular, I think is an important principle. So a consideration of those, but I think there's also more recent developments around efforts and cross-party efforts to develop a minimum income guarantee in Scotland. So there's new evidence, a new interim report about to be published from that work at the end of March, and I think it would be useful for the committee to consider some of the evidence that's starting to emerge from that process, one that embodies perhaps some of the principles that we would like to see in the way that we develop a social security system. So I think that those would be two key areas: looking at how principles are applied in practice and looking at these new developments around minimum income guarantee.
Vaughan Bailey wanted to raise a point.
It was related to Selene's, but because we were running out of time at the point. I'm really interested in the computer says no issues in the universal credit system already, and we come up against some really daft things. You mentioned sort of the upfront payments with childcare, which is gender barrier. We've also got a really weird interaction between child maintenance and universal credit in terms of collection for paying parents. So we're not going to have time today, but if you do have anything already within your wealth of expertise and reports that you've done, which is basically lists of things that we should look at, which are daft in terms of making the actual system work, but also penalising claimants, I would really be interested to see that. And then just separately, just going through the questions, and I was thinking about this last night, I want to just say out loud, and I've said this before in the committee, I am surprised how often the welfare system is now coming up on doorsteps, and it is coming up quite a bit with employers, and the discussion is that it's starting to not work again, and it's stopping people getting into work, so whether work pays and those types of, and we're not back in 2010, 2015 type arguments, but I'd be just interested very briefly whether that's something that's coming up and coming across your desks as well, and how we could look at it really in our inquiry. So should we come to Peter, because I'm conscious that we haven't heard from you for a minute.
Thank you. And on the last point about the interaction between the social security system and the labour market, I think is a critical issue. I'm not convinced at the moment the issue is the entitlements that people have through the social security system that are causing the disruption in the labour market and the shortages in terms of staff in the labour market. In our work around the real living wage and our engagement with employers on the living wage, they don't tend to talk to us about those problems in relation to recruitment, where social security is seen as a barrier. So I think generally the issue of the interaction between labour market and social security is absolutely one that we do need to consider, and particularly in the light of the progress I think that's been made in terms of taper rates in recent years. So I think that is an important issue we don't want to lose sight of. I think also, just to go back very, very quickly to a couple of other questions on the revolutionary nature of what's being discussed here, I think actually even a discussion around adequacy in relation to social security is quite radical, that we haven't had this for decades, if at all, at least since the 60s, as far as I know. So I think the importance of this this inquiry can't be understated. John Vight-Wilson talked about income adequacy as the clean water of anti-poverty policy, and I think it really is. So I think the idea of a guarantee that ourselves and JRF and others have talked about is really quite transformative as well, where people are entitled to a level of support that's guaranteed and can't be removed. That's a really important consideration in terms of the thinking of our social security system.